Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1001 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And today we are looking at James Brown's 1963 album, Live at the Apollo. Live at the Apollo was released under the King label with producers James Brown himself, art direction Dan Quest, nationality USA, and a running time of 31 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, this live album, like most live albums in this book, have quite the historical significance, and this one especially might be the most significant that I've heard so far. Because before this album, live albums were seen as a risk to labels. That was until James Brown insisted on having this one made, much to the dismay of his record label founder, Sid Nathan, who continually declined in creating this album or having it made at all, as he felt like most people at the time, live albums would be a total fluke and a total loss for the company at whole. That being said, James Brown pushed continually for this to be made and actually allegedly funded this album himself and had it pushed out all on his own on the King label. And it's a great thing that it did, because this album went on to become one of the highest selling albums consecutively for, I believe it was 66 weeks. And it's really easy to see why this album caught on so well and really took hold of the community, because this is just a fantastic short half hour that really shows the talents of James Brown and his band, The Famous Flames. And speaking of The Famous Flames, throughout this half hour, they create this amazing contrast to James Brown and really greatly complement James Brown's style. Their sense of chemistry can be felt greatly throughout the entire album, and right from the first track, when they are first introduced by Fats Gander, they are just a fantastic backup to James Brown, although giving him enough room to be the star of his own show still. The first track really just introduced The Famous Flames, like I said, and James Brown's nowhere to be seen until the second track, where he comes on quite strongly and really interacts with the audience, just like a great performer should. He's quick to show off his soulful voice and his overall performance appeal by putting on quite the show for the audience members, who become just as much as part of the recording as James Brown and The Famous Flames themselves. On the third track, Try Me, James Brown slows things down from what was already introduced in the first two songs, and in doing so creates a much more atmospheric and nostalgic-like sort of song. And it's funny, because even though I obviously didn't exist in the early 1960s, this song is able to bring anyone back to that time and era. It feels very transportive in just the overall atmosphere and aesthetic of the track. And I think that's one thing that really speaks volumes to a live album, is if they're able to capture the atmosphere of the night so vividly that upon listening to it decades later, you can still feel as if you are one with that audience. And speaking of this audience, like I said, being just as much of a role to the album as The Famous Flames and James Brown himself, the ninth track is a great highlight of the album to show this. At 10 minutes in length, this track really takes its time to develop. It has a very simple band structure in the background, having a very soft instrumental, letting James Brown do his almost screaming-like performance that he is so vividly known for. It continually builds itself up, adding layers upon layers, very delicately putting together a strong 10-minute track, while at the same time letting James Brown be the center stage because of how subtle it is. Never being too loud or too fast-paced to overbear James Brown or overthrow him as the star. But of course, with James Brown doing his sort of shouting-like style that he is known for, the audience members really add their own sense of instrumental structure with just their chants and calls and screams. Mostly, of course, girls at the time were in this audience, and you really feel as if they are just as important and detrimental to James Brown as The Famous Flames are, because their continual calls, screams, and hollers at James Brown feel very authentic and passionate and real and raw. This sort of audience is something that you would expect just as much today at any other concert, but it feels much more intimate, as it is very clear that the Apollo is a much more enclosed and smaller sort of event than what we might expect from a huge, massive stadium like today. And in this much smaller event, it does feel more intimate, like I was saying, by having it such a concentrated audience. And their screams, again, never feel like they are destroying the recording or damaging the sound in any way, like I've heard on many other live albums that really don't mix that well. I mean, I would say that the mixing on Live at the Apollo is so well done that everything feels completely balanced across the board and never feels like anything is being taken away or overblown to a great effect. There's also the instrumental bridges throughout this album at only about 3 of them. The longest one clocks in at I think about 16 or 20 seconds or something like that. None of them are longer than 20 and none of them are shorter than 10, really creating these very small bursts of instrumental bridges that feel just absolutely significant still to the overall concept of the album, as every single track flows from one to the next greatly because of these instrumental bridges, letting the songs sort of shift their focus and style ever so slightly. And speaking of songs that flow beautifully into each other, there is of course the 10th track, which is a medley of 3 songs, and this medley is again handled by James Brown so well and so fluidly that you don't even quite realize it might be a medley, as it is so smooth in how it manages to transfer from one section to the next. And the smoothness of this album really does carry on from prior to this all the way to the end. The entire album is just an incredibly smooth, great, soulful experience, and really shows why James Brown is seen as an incredibly influential and important performer. Because above all else, if there's one thing I have gotten from this album and learned from this album, it's that performing and being a performer is far more significant than the music itself. If you are a great performer and you are able to put on a show, you can have a pretty much flawless album, and James Brown definitely has that going for him here in this album. It is incredibly influential and left a huge mark on so many bands to come, and definitely put an imprint on the live album genre in general, as this, again, like I said, was the first major success in that sort of category. And many great albums would later be made in history because of this significant, important album here. So with that all being said, the soft rating of this album came to a 9.5 out of 10, and I'll go ahead and leave it at a 9.5 out of 10. I'm not going to lower it, that's for sure, and one day I might even see raising it to a 10, but for now, I'm going to leave it where it is at a 9.5. And of course, with its extreme historical significance and its influence on so many artists to come, it is definitely an E for essential, especially since this is also the only James Brown in this book, and James Brown's significance in itself is definitely worthy of a listen to any music fan, as his legendary status is quite significant at this point. Anyways, that pretty much does it for this review. Let's go ahead and see what the next album we're listening to is in the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. All right, random number generator, 1 to 1001, generate number 5. 5 out of 1001. That's really low, which is going to be 5 being Fats Domino's 1956 album, This Is Fats. This is the first 50s album I have reviewed so far, so I'm excited for that. Anyways, if you like this album, please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along and listening to every single album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And as always, my name is Randy Joe, and I am signing off.